You're watching Force 13's live streaming service. Well, the occasion tonight, or today as it is early in the morning over in the Western Pacific Basin, is tracking Typhoon Haishen, which will be making landfall in South Korea probably within the next 2 hours. It has just blown through the western coast of Kyushu and moved over one of the islands there. I believe it was Shinkamigoto, and also passed just near the Amami Islands. Still a powerful typhoon this, and still a Category 2 holding on to it right now, and significantly growing wind field. Typhoon warnings extending as far as western Shikoku and further up the Japanese coast on the main island of Honshu. Also tonight we'll be discussing Atlantic systems as well. There are 2 high chances right now, as well as 2 low chances in the Atlantic Basin. Interestingly, if you've not received the info yet, 30% chance now in 5 days for Disturbance 4. That's the one that could approach North Carolina. We'll get onto that a little bit later on, but to begin with, we're going to be mainly talking about Typhoon Haishen. We're expecting now probably a borderline Category 2 landfall in South Korea, and this is going to happen in very short order indeed. This is about a 6-hour loop, and the storm at this point is probably about 2 hours offshore. My name is Nathan Foy. I'm joined by just 2 of our team tonight, but 2 very reliable sources, David and Strat. Good afternoon, evening, morning to you both.
Yes, it's good morning at my HQ, 6:02, and I think Japan about an hour behind me. But what does one say about the typhoon? I've been monitoring it, and it's got a 23 nautical mile eye. That's the latest or current from the Joint Typhoon Warning Center. And viewers, Nathan and I were talking about it before we came on air. And Nathan, do you think it's closing?
Well, no, I don't. The storm is broadening out. It's starting to have that look when storms gain latitude. Sooner or later it's going to start an extratropical transition. Isn't too far off the cards, but its current location there, approaching the southeastern part of the Korean peninsula, and towards the center you can see what's left of its eye. It had a beautiful eye when it was peaking. We certainly believe it was a Category 5, if not on one occasion, then 2. Right now, obviously, it's nowhere near. It is a Category 2 with winds estimated of 100 miles per hour and a pressure of 952. But even though the winds are starting to decrease, this is an enormous wind field, and I imagine it's going to be quite a rainmaker as well. Strat?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously going to be a significant rainfall threat and wind threat for much of the Korean peninsula as we head into the next day now, as the system really ramps up and moves northward at an accelerating pace. Starting to look slightly less tropical than before, of course. That's kind of what you said happens when these systems gain latitude. But regardless of that, a very large wind threat for significant land areas with that pretty large wind field now, and a notably low pressure for a storm of its current strength. That's partly due to its latitude.
Naturally.
But because of its size, its rainfall threat is also expanding not just through the Koreas to pretty substantial areas already, but reaching further east and south into Japan still.
I'm just looking actually, and interestingly, the rainfall expectations aren't maybe as high as you might think. The highest expected rainfall is still around 300 millimeters, but that's just about over the border in North Korea for a small part of the coastal area on the east side. In South Korea, you're looking at generally most central parts of South Korea might not even get to 100 millimeters. Coastal regions will get the most rain. You're looking at over 100 millimeters, up towards 200, maybe a little more than that as well. But this storm is moving pretty quickly at this point, and we expect that it will make landfall in about 2 hours. Considering how far it is right now on this satellite imagery, that's pretty soon.
Yeah, I mean, I just think something to note about those rainfall totals as well is because this thing's moving pretty quickly and really only going to accelerate in speed at least for the next 6 to 12 hours or so. When we're talking about 100 millimeters to 200 millimeters for some coastal areas, a lot of that can occur in a relatively short time span. We talk a lot about flash flooding for severe weather risks and hurricane risks in the United States, for example, but that's a major risk here as well, at least in comparison to some of the other risks on the table.
And of course, some of the mountainous areas as well are susceptible to landslides.
Yeah, I mean, that's also something else you got to keep in mind. When we're talking about the United States, a lot of the times, most of the coastal areas generally aren't that mountainous. But here in Korea, you're going to see some more mountainous terrain come in pretty quickly. You're right about that. Mudslides are definitely a risk as well.
Yeah, we hear a lot about that in Japan mainly when typhoons blow through, and in the Philippines, but South Korea as well, I would imagine. We're also joined by Thomas Schwent. Good evening to you over there in the US.
Good evening, Nathan. Thank you for having me.
And what's your thoughts of this storm as it's been progressing throughout the last few days?
Well, it's been a really interesting progression from a meteorological standpoint, and it's been bad news overall for those in Japan and South Korea, just because it's the third typhoon now in the span of, I think it's about 2 weeks to impact this region generally. But it's been an extraordinary storm to watch, from its rapid intensification to its transition to being extremely large, as it's been undergoing the sidewall replacement cycle. And overall, my thoughts on it right now are that I'm just hoping that people in Japan and South Korea are prepared, because the storm's here and it's not going away for the next few hours at least.
Its influence is pretty big. We look at the infrared imagery there. It covers the entire Korean peninsula and beyond at this stage. And on the southern side, its influence can still be seen in the Amami Islands. So you draw a line, that's probably about, I don't know how far that is, that's quite a distance, maybe 1,000 miles, maybe more. That's obviously not the wind speeds, but the cloud coverage.
Yeah, I know that some quadrants of the storm, the JTWC has estimated it over, I think it was 250 miles last I checked. Let me double check that.
I've got it here. The northeast quadrant, they're having it at 305 nautical miles in the northeastern quadrant, which is about 340 miles or so. So that's quite broad.
That's significantly larger than forecast. That might actually drive up the CDPS rating.
And the minimum is the southwest quadrant, which is 215 nautical miles. That's a minimum. Usually you barely see Atlantic storms get to those 200 numbers for perspective.
I think to give, just a bit of perspective on that from recent storms at least, because I know everyone's got some recency bias when we're talking about tracking. Laura, if I'm not mistaken, really only reached the zenith in terms of, peak expansion of tropical storm force winds a little over 200 miles in the northeastern quadrant. So when you're talking about that as the minimum for Hyshen right now, it puts in perspective how large the system is.
I don't think it even reached 200, Laura. I think it was about 180,
oh, did it really not?
190, something like that.
I mean, that really goes to prove the point even more than just the size of the storm. And not just that for wind, but if you just look at the satellite imagery, you can see it pretty clearly in infrared. I'm not sure if there's radar too. But some of those bands are extending significantly further out to the north and west as well, even further away from the wind fields. You can see this with those colder cloud tops reaching up, trying to bring some rainfall activity.
The right imagery. There we go.
So some of those are reaching, well into China even, not just into South Korea and North Korea, but some of those are reaching not just into northeastern China, but trying to look closer towards Beijing and other regions of eastern China too.
Wow. I don't have radar to hand, but if anyone does have that in my group here, please show us. That would be much appreciated. I don't think I could bring it up either, because the Korean radar is more of an app style, isn't it? So I can't bring it to you in image format, which is what I require for display on this screen here, unless I can get it up elsewhere. Just a moment, we're going to work on this live. Yes, I think we actually can get this. Hold on a moment. this...
And to answer a question quickly as well,
There it is.
This is still substantially smaller than Sandy in terms of wind field to the person asking that question, but it's still a very large storm nonetheless.
Let's just blow that up on... Oh dear, we're moving it around too much. Blow it up on the screen if we can. There's the latest radar imagery. Can we get that to animate? It's animating somewhere. Here it comes. So there's some radar imagery of the storm approaching the Korean islands. Oh, is that actually a forecast? That's a Okay, we've got some radar there and a radar forecast, as far as I can tell. So that's what they're forecasting the storm's center to be, just along the southeastern periphery. Yeah, so I believe the initial image here is actually the nowcast, and that's looking forward in time. Still interesting, though.
Because of how large that wind field is, I did just figure out the CDPS scale, which was at a stage 7 last night when I hosted the stream, has risen back up to stage 8.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, if we're looking at population metrics here, at least in comparison to areas looking for tropical storm force or gale force wind, I mean, right now at least, it's easily over 50 million that are expecting gale force winds within the next 24 hours, right?
Yep, easily.
I mean, you know, the wind field from this storm means that right now you're going to have gale force winds near Kyoto, which is all the way closer to central Japan.
Really?
Reaching all the way through Kyushu, yeah. That's pretty close to the gale force wind extent. Not quite there, but close. Reaching all the way back to the center of the storm right now.
All right.
Going up past Seoul, well into North Korea, and could actually even reach Vladivostok in Russia as well before moving into China as the storm weakens.
This is actually live radar now, we've got it. So the latest frame on this image, let me just get that timestamp when it gets to the end. They're in 5-minute intervals, and the most recent one there is 5:05, so that's just 7 minutes ago. So the last frame on this loop is obviously the most recent, but rather recent at about 7 minutes ago. I'm trying to get it to run faster. There it goes. Okay, we got it running fast. I'm still getting used to these controls. I'm navigating Korean websites. So there we go. That's the storm's progression right now. The northern eye wall looking pretty solid there still. Lots of reds. I'm still not really used to these images. But I can tell you these colors denote rain rates. So in the red zones there, you're looking at between 10 and 30 millimeters per hour. And if you see any sort of lilac zones there, and you can see it near the beginning in particular, those are 30 to 60 millimeters per hour. If you see another color on top of that, which is a purplish color, not sure you can see any there, but if you do ever see that, that's over 60 millimeters per hour. The yellow is 5 to 10, the greens are 1 to 5, and the blue is less than 1.
I mean, that really goes to show, you know, some of those heavier bands reaching significantly far away from the center, even though the center of the system is still south of Busan right now. You have some of those heavier bands trying to reach up towards Seoul and North Korea as well. Yeah. So, I mean, it is a very large and dangerous storm.
And most of it is tilted on the northwestern side, to be honest, where the Korean Peninsula lies.
I mean, that's one of the unfortunate things when you kind of see the rain shield kind of expand northwestward out like this ahead of the storm when it's southeast of land, generally southeast of where it's heading, for the short term at least, is that impacts, at least rain, not necessarily all the winds, will arrive sooner than the actual center of the storm, which can prolong actual impacts. You know, if you want a comparison on a much weaker scale from this year so far, at least you can consider Faye when it impacted the Northeast as a weak tropical storm, even though it was displaced off to the south and east. Those rainfall bands extending off to the north and west meant the worst impacts, and even impacts in general, start lashing areas sooner than you might expect otherwise, just looking at the center of the storm and where the wind radius is, which means for preparations at least, some people might not be able to really get exactly to where they wanted to do in terms of completing their preparations, just because conditions around them start to become much more inclement sooner than some might have anticipated.
Yeah, just trying to get I think this is a higher resolution. Yep, this is better radar imagery. There's another look. So you can see once again, these are the millimeters per hour rain rates that you can see on this radar. Thomas has gone, okay. But Strat and David, you're able to see this. What can you discern from this imagery? You able to see that?
Yeah, I see that. I don't know what David wants to say about it as well. I'm pretty sure you probably agree
No,
that we're really looking at a situation with the heaviest rainfall just offshore southeastern South Korea right now, really. And that's going to come onshore pretty quick.
And this goes over a 2-hour period. So this is how far it's moved in 2 hours. It was off the Japanese island chain there, which I've already forgotten the name of, and it's now approaching the Korean peninsula. It's almost halfway there since passing that island 2 hours ago. So you would think that landfall will be in about 2 hours' time.
Well, it's very windy and wet in Seoul. I was just looking at a couple of live webcams, and we know conditions are going to get worse for the capital.
What you can see, actually, and I've mentioned this already, the models that were showing that rainfall would be worst on the coastline. You actually are already seeing that. You can see the red zones there hugging the western coast, and then you've got more of it on the eastern coast as well, just starting to get up there, and you're going to see that becoming a trend throughout the morning. The center of the storm, though, will just be grazing the southeastern tip of the Korean peninsula. And it will probably still be packing winds of at least 90 miles per hour or 150 kilometers per hour, sustained when it arrives. Could deliver a significant storm surge, and again, everyone is wary over there. I'm pretty sure this is the third typhoon to strike the Korean peninsula in about a week and a half, which is certainly quite a remarkable feat in itself.
Just climatologically, how often would you really see 3 typhoon-strength storms? Well, I know Bobby didn't make landfall in South Korea, but at least, Masak did as a typhoon. How often do you see 2 of those occur within the span of a week, if we're just talking historical precedent?
I don't know about Korea, but obviously you can get that quite a lot in the Philippines. But I will see if I can do my due diligence on that. But yep. I've got no idea, basically.
I mean, I will say, one of the things with this storm, at least, the past 2 days, gotta give credit to the JTWC and JMA where it's due for the intensity forecast, at least for near the landfall point. Both of them are pretty adamant around 80 to 85 knots, and it's looking like that's going to be pretty close to what we get. So good on them for giving the proper head time for winds. Of course, we would have wanted the storm to weaken more. It's unfortunate we're still seeing a Cat 2 or a high-end Cat 1 slam into southeastern Korea here. A bit of a different picture than we were looking at even just 2 weeks ago when we were thinking, oh, maybe Bobby could try to make a Category 3 landfall near Busan. Fortunately, that shifted way off to the west and past the latitude of Busan as a Category 3 equivalent, but well off to the west as it started to weaken. But less than 2 weeks later, we have another storm that's going to make landfall in pretty much the same spot that we were first looking for another typhoon just 2 weeks ago.
Indeed, as we look at it on the satellite imagery here, send in your comments and questions for us live. We'll be able to respond to them on the air as this storm approaches land. Just looking through some other types of imagery to see if there's anything interesting that I can put up on the screen as we look at this infrared imagery. Of course, visibles will arrive later. Of course, it's 5:15 there, so it shouldn't be too far from daylight.
I will say one of the most interesting things about this particular imagery, because I know it's partly infrared, of course, because nighttime visible imagery doesn't really work, yeah. But seeing all the lights still up there in southeastern South Korea, it's going to be interesting to see if there's any difference heading into tomorrow, really, to see what kind of power outages occur. It's going to be an interesting metric, at least from a point that's, visible from the naked eye rather than just those graphical maps, to see if there's any real significant damage from the winds and potential flooding in that regard as we head past this storm.
Well, I don't think this actual imagery is actually showing the lights. It's just an overlay.
Oh gosh.
But
Well, I mean,
on
we're,
visible
we're
imagery at night and sometimes nighttime visibles, you can see things like that, and we have seen things like that documented in the past, particularly in the Atlantic.
Yeah, I mean, I know we always aren't looking necessarily out here to this side of the world, because a lot of the time we're talking about the Atlantic, but it will be interesting to see if we can see
Especially in a
any
year like this.
physical. Definitely a year like this. We already got two more invests with over 70% chance of development in the next 5 days there. But it's going to be interesting, at least from a visible standpoint, just from looking from outer space, if we can see if there's any physical impact left behind, just in terms of lights, really, with Hyshen. Really are getting down to last second here before landfall. It's less than 2 to 3 hours now. A question I
That's
saw earlier.
hours,
Did it
not
make
seconds, but yeah.
okay? Hours. Yeah, I'm sorry. Did it make landfall in any portions of Japan earlier today,
Yeah,
Hyshen?
it did. It made landfall on whatever that island is, Shinkamigoto, I believe it is, which is on a small chain of islands there off the western coast of Kyushu, and it's now passing just west of Tsushima. It will pass very close to there. Looks like the landfall zone in Korea might be. I mean, it could even be Busan, honestly.
Yeah,
If it
it's going to be very close to Busan,
jumps
really.
east a little bit, or if further west, maybe Changwon, before moving inland a little bit. But it's going to be close. But those areas, obviously, they're going to be affected by this the most.
Yeah, I think this, an important note though is, when the track first shifted, out towards the west pretty heavily, because initially we were looking at potential Kyushu landfall, and then the track shifted way west towards, western South Korea, and people started to let their guards down a bit for portions of Japan at least. This is why it's important for this storm in particular, and of course any future storms around, not just for this part of the world, but anywhere really, wherever you're watching from. If you're in the path of a storm potentially, and it begins to trend away a little bit, that doesn't mean you should let your guard down or lower your preparations and pay less attention, because the cone of uncertainty exists for a reason. Even if in this case Haishen moved that far to the west in reality, and there wasn't any track shift back to the east, you know, most of Kyushu would have still gotten gale force sustained winds anyways, for one. And two, shifts back do happen as well. And then you're ending up in a situation that you really don't want to be in, where you're underprepared, with the storm potentially knocking on your door pretty soon, and you weren't paying proper attention. So, always keep in mind those cones and situations like that.
And there is
impacts.
the cone from JTWC, the last forecast they did. There should be a new one out soon, but this was the last one. They went with 95 knots earlier today, and they were forecasting a landfall in South Korea. Actually 75 knots, which is down a little bit, 85 miles an hour. I think it'll be a little bit higher than that, at least 90, possibly still 100 by the time it reaches the coast. So it would be a Category 2 landfall. And before these three storms, we were talking about how the strongest South Korea landfall on record was a 115 mile per hour Category 3 in 1959, and I always forget whether it's Sarah or Sally, one of the two. But obviously none of these storms have met that strength, but of course this one is pretty darn big. You look at that wind field, actually you look at that wind field there on that forecast, those curious radials, those show the wind field quadrants. The outermost one, the sort of reddish colour, that's the gale force wind quadrant. That's 40 mile an hour winds, 65 kilometers per hour sustained or higher. And you can see how it stretches over about a quarter of Japan, and then more than enough to engulf the whole Korean peninsula.
I mean, when we're talking high population densities, which is a lot of South Korea, especially, the bigger cities, Busan, Seoul, for example, that means, in comparison, Lore,
Yeah.
for example, made a very powerful landfall in an area that generally wasn't super populated.
There's over 50 million people at risk of destructive winds.
Yeah, exactly. Even though, isn't the largest country in landmass, high population density combined with a very significant wind field means that lots of areas are under risk of damaging winds.
Oh look, there's us. I'm on our live feed. I'm trying to get back to our radar. Where's our radar? There's our radar.
Someone asked, do we
There's
got
still
any
on the active. Yeah, go
do
ahead.
we have any activity coming up in the near future in the Western Pacific after this? I haven't been keeping track of the models in this basin that much.
Most likely not, because we're expecting that there is just a little disturbance that could possibly develop into a weak storm near the Philippines, over the Philippine Sea. Probably won't affect anywhere, really, but that's just a little hint from models. Apart from that, there's nothing. At this point, I suppose we should take a look around the world. We will come back to Hyshen, obviously. Here's the Eastern Pacific. You can see Julio there on the right-hand side. What do you think of Julio, Strat?
Probably one of the surprises of the season, really, especially because a couple days ago it was at 1020 in terms of percentage odds of development. You know, it generally was not anticipated by models or forecasts.
It's the remnants of an Atlantic storm. You know it's going to form. You know it.
Well, I mean, knowing this year, I guess.
It's
but,
got that Atlantic
consensus,
magic.
It really wasn't expected that we'd see the remnants of Nana really transform into something else in the Eastern Pacific. You know, but it really pulled off something that wasn't expected with the mid-level circulation remnants of Nana. You know, it's surprising to think what could have occurred if the low-level center remained a bit more intact as it crossed over into the basin, to tell you the truth.
True. And here's the Atlantic right now. You can see those two invests that are starting to make the crossing. Invest 92L, first of all, looking really good on that satellite imagery, on visible at least. Starting to get some better rotation, can't be far away from TD status. And Invest 93, which is just emerging off the coast of Africa and already has rotation as well. That could be a tropical storm for the Cape Verde Islands as well.
Yeah, I mean, even the GFS, which has struggled with initialization this year in general, has 93L at or close to tropical cyclone status within the next 24 hours as it approaches Cape Verde.
Wow.
So, I mean, a lot of support for that one, at least, to develop quite rapidly right now. I think it's a high percent or medium percent for the next 2 days and then a high in the next 5 for the time being. But I wouldn't be surprised to see that changed upward at the 8 p.m. Tropical weather outlook based on the current, look of the storm and its developments. And like you said, 92L starting to look much more impressive as well. It was looking much more sparse earlier today, at least in convective activity. It did have some rotation, but it's really picking back up again now.
Everyone would also be pleased to know that Omar died. It lasted nearly 3.5 days longer than the National Hurricane Center thought it would at first.
I mean, that was incredible, to tell you the truth. Definitely a nuisance for shipping paths, of course, because that thing kept flaring up convection, longer than anyone thought it possibly could. But at least it wasn't really a land threat in terms of impacts.
All right, let's see if we've got some more questions then. What is the actual barometric pressure of Hyshen? I believe there was a recorded pressure of 951 earlier this morning. In one of the Japanese islands. I've done it again. I have to look at this screen because that's where the live chat is, so do pardon me on that. And it also happens to be where the radar is, which I'm getting to. There it is. But on one of those islands that the storm pretty much passed over, I believe there was a pressure recording of 951. I've only heard this secondhand, so I don't know for sure, but that's what we heard.
JMA is saying 945 millibars as of their last update. So still a storm with a very low pressure right now.
It's high 40s, probably lower 50s. We're going with 952 right now.
I mean, it really just goes to show these higher latitude storms that get really strong further south of the Western Pacific and keep these low pressures that they expand pretty far north. 945 millibars for a Cat 2 storm right now. Just a comparison for strength pressure. Sort of a ratio almost. In the Atlantic, a couple weeks ago, Laura's peak was 936 to 938 millibars as a 150 to 155 mile an hour storm. So it really goes to show these storms are holding their pressures really deep as they continue to move northward in the basin here.
More questions. First of all, there was... Hold on, where did it go? How close do you think 92L and 93L are to tropical depression status? Another look at the Atlantic there.
Well, what are you thinking about it, Nathan?
I think that 92L must surely get to tropical depression status in the next 24 hours, and 93L possibly in 24 hours, and more likely in 48.
Yeah, I mean, the odds here right now, at least, was it 90% in the next 2 days for 92L? It's the further west one. Starting to look quite impressive already, so would probably be surprising if the trend doesn't continue and it gets designated in the next day or so. And then 93L, which is the one just emerging off of Africa right now, they actually did up it to 70% for the next 48 hours, so they are trying to get more bullish on quicker development on it now.
All right. I'm just looking up someone else's query, and that query was whether the tropical cyclone landfall frequency in Korea is similar to the New England mid-Atlantic regions. I can tell you that the statistics say that it is about twice as busy as New England. That's about the best I can say for you right now.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of past tracking experience as well as living in the Northeast, I can tell you with pretty high degree of certainty, and there's going to be data to back that up as well for anyone that really wants to look it up as well, that South Korea and the Korean Peninsula do see more tropical cyclone activity than the Northeast in any given year most of the time, per se. Of course, the Northeast had an anomalous 2 tropical storms for New England, at least in terms of warnings and impacts within a month early on in the season. We had Faye and Isaias, which was much more dangerous. But if you want to compare the Northeast already this year to Korea, they've had 3 typhoon approaches in the past 2 weeks alone, and one of them made landfall in South Korea as a typhoon. The other one's about to do so. So even now, South Korea is still seeing more typhoon activity, even in a notoriously inactive season for the whole basin there.
That it is, and even despite these systems, it is still an inactive season by some distance, by a big distance. But usually in these, it's the quieter seasons that sometimes produce the more memorable sequences.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you don't have a lot of activity going on, the ocean heat content and general sea surface temperatures can build up and simmer for a longer period of time. You can get to those points where the water's steaming, going really deep down.
Usually it means bad news for the Philippines. 2010, one of the quietest seasons on record. Had Typhoon Meggy, of course, Category 5 landfall in Luzon, 185 miles per hour. 1998, another very quiet season, started ridiculously late. I think it only had its 6th storm by September the 11th, which is remarkable. Had a Category 5 that hit the Philippines, Zeb. And thinking back to some of the other seasons as well, no, I'm struggling actually. I can't think back to what happened in 1983 and 1973. I was testing myself there. Never mind.
I mean, it really goes to the point that it only takes one storm to make the entire year for any basin, whether it be the Atlantic, say Andrew back in the 90s, or even this year for the Western Pacific, for example. One storm can really make the difference in how everyone remembers an entire year for a basin. Even if it's a notoriously inactive year, you've got one really strong one. It makes a big difference.
Yeah, but then, for people listening and they hear us say things like that, if we do get one, there could just as easily be 2.
I mean, that's true as well. You can have a very slow season and then still have, 2 to 3 storms that occur that are just really big events, So the storm count doesn't really matter as much as the types of storms that are ongoing and where they're impacting, to be fair. For at least comparison this year, the Atlantic season's been absolutely historically active to this point, but only 5 of those 15 named storms so far have become hurricanes. 4 of those were Category 1s, but we did have 2 very significant, so far at least, Atlantic impacts at least. So
it'd be very interesting
really
to compare this
all over the place.
To compare this against those really old Atlantic seasons, and whether, if they only had satellite back then, whether there were seasons like this back then or not, and we only saw the worst ones. In a season like this, what storms would we have missed? We would have missed. I can't even recall half the names at this point. What was our first storm?
That was Arthur, I think.
Yes,
I don't.
we
Honestly,
wouldn't have
it's
missed
hard to
that. We wouldn't have missed Bertha. We wouldn't miss Cristobal. We would have missed Dolly. We might have missed Edward. We wouldn't have missed Faye. I'm losing it at this point. Gonzalo, we might have missed. Thinking past.
Definitely not Hannah or Isaias.
I know. I'm thinking past that, but we would have missed a few. I just wonder whether some of those other old seasons, and indeed those very active ones, might have had extra storms as well.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, regardless though, it's one of the interesting things to note. Really, it goes both the activity of the Atlantic today as well as the inactivity in the Western Pacific.
And it really has.
The Atlantic's almost 50% ahead in terms of tropical depression designations compared to the Western Pacific year to date. And I'm pretty sure the Eastern Pacific's also ahead of the Western Pacific Basin as well. So, I mean, a very quiet year to start off, at least for the Western Pacific. But if we really go through kind of closer to peak season activity with no real storms in the next 2 to 3 weeks or so, it could be looking at a very low storm count potentially, unless the late season is just really active.
You're missing something here. The Western Pacific peak has already happened. Statistically, that's on August 31st.
I mean, if that's really, that is the case too. So we're really going downhill here now in terms of conditions for the basin then. Maybe we get an unusual later peak in October, November, if there's a lot of activity in the tropical convergence zone then, but historically, this could be one of the quietest years that we've seen in the basin for a long time.
And people talking about history as well. How many storms did the 1914 season really have in the Atlantic? I guess I was asking for that kind of question. Obviously, there was the one that's officially a tropical storm, the other one that was a tropical depression, which we've put down as a tropical storm because there were 35 knot wind barbs recorded. And there are about 5 or 6 others that are inconclusive. So unfortunately, we can't say any more than that. The data's just too missing. And a question about Hurricane Week 2020 and whether we're doing it. We are hoping to do it. More documentary features about hurricanes and typhoons past and present. That will be coming up. We'll see if we can get any more details in the coming weeks. But right now you're watching live commentary and coverage of Typhoon Haishen, which is approaching the southeastern tip of South Korea, and it's expected to make landfall in about 2 hours or so. We also have a live feed, satellite feed running of this storm, and that will continue until probably late this evening local time in Korea. So throughout the day you'll be able to take a look on there as well. Right now we're estimating winds of 100 miles per hour, a pressure of 952 millibars, that's 160 kilometers per hour sustained winds. Might drop just a little bit more before landfall, but it's going to be a pretty big hit, and as you can see, quite a large one as well. You're not talking so much as intense like category 5 or whatever, but we are talking about a very large storm with a gale force wind radius in the northeastern quadrant extending out over 330 miles, which is probably about nearly 600 kilometers.
And moving straight into a population area of over 50 million people too to get some of those winds. So, extremely threatening storm. We were talking about some of the rainfall totals earlier, and radar's kind of emphasizing some of those heavier bands are really starting to come on shore pretty quickly now, as the storm's about to make landfall in the next 2 to 3 hours or so. Might be a little bit less than that now, actually, based on the fact we've already been live for 40 minutes and the storm's still moving at a quick clip.
As expected, it is moving very quick, moving just past Tsushima right now to the west. Be very close to a landfall, but not quite by the looks of things.
What is its forward speed right now, actually? I'm sorry.
I don't fully know. It looks pretty quick to me, but I don't have a concrete number on that.
I'll see if I can find something really quick. It was the last one, the JTWC was saying 23 knots was the forward speed. So it really accelerated its pace within the past 12 to 18 hours. And in perspective, that's closer to 27 or so miles an hour in forward speed. So this thing is moving at a very nice clip right now.
Let me just see if I can corroborate that slightly. Let's see what the... Okay, in the last hour, the storm has moved 25 miles.
Yeah, so a bit slower than the update there, but still moving very quickly. At this pace, it'll probably be in North Korea in terms of latitude, whether or not it emerges briefly offshore again at that point,
probably will.
Or stays inland. Yeah, it'll probably reach that area now, probably within 12 hours or so, if not a bit less, depending on whether or not it tries to accelerate again. So, I mean, this thing's moving very quickly.
Considering the activity off the Atlantic, do you have any more public changes to the total storms for the Atlantic? I assume the prediction you're talking about. Our last prediction was in early August, and we called for 20... What was it? 23?
23, yeah.
Tropical storms in the Atlantic. We might... I mean, we're not going to be publicizing any more forecasts at this point, because I don't see the real need. It's near peak season. But I'd definitely have an open mind to more storms than 23, considering we've already had 15.
And this is probably going to be something important later in the year as well. You know, this is the peak of the season coming up in the next 2 to 3 weeks in terms of, you know, the ability to get these very powerful hurricanes coming off the coast of Africa and forming from these tropical waves. But if we're looking to really push that storm total up, you're going to need a lot of subtropic activity. And even as we've headed into peak season, we've seen that persist to a pretty almost spectacular degree. You know, Omar wasn't a tropical origin storm. That became the earliest 15th named storm on record. If I'm not mistaken, at least to date, around half or a bit more than half of the named storms in the basin of the Atlantic have come from non-tropical origin. So not tropical waves or normal circumstances from, say, even the Eastern Pacific, which was Cristobal. We've had a lot of, you know, kind of trough cutoffs come through, or other originally non-tropical origin sources that have become tropical cyclones.
All right, Tsushima getting a bit of a battering right now. You can see some of those purples over land. You're talking 30 to 60 millimeters per hour of rain. That's the rain rate. Not to say that there will be 60 millimeters in an hour, only if you get that color sustained for an hour over that location. Which it won't, because this is at 5-minute intervals and it's been over there for about 2 or 3 frames at most. So do the math on that one.
Definitely shows the risk of some isolated flash flooding, though, coming on with this system, and of course broader risks for, you know, some lighter flooding and of course mudslides as well, because not getting up to the 60 millimeters an hour, of course, but if you're under an area of, you know, 15 to 30 millimeters an hour consistently, that can raise the risk of at least some localized flash flooding for your area if you're in a pretty poor condition location.
This is very interesting to look at, because I can't quite tell on this imagery now whether that is the center that is now drifting east and could move over Tsushima and maybe even past east of Tsushima, or whether, you know, that's just one little feature in a wider eye whose center is actually slightly west of Tsushima. Because if it is east, then it could be very possible that it doesn't make a South Korea landfall at all. Doesn't mean much. Landfalls are mainly symbolic. It would still be extremely close to land, and it would still cause around about the same impacts, but that would be interesting.
Is there any way to try to lay satellite imagery next to this or on top of it to kind of see perspective, to see if that's really potentially a bit of an eastward jog, or if it's rather instead just a part of the broader feature with the system? Because I know, even though the eye is mostly clouded now, that it's still quite large, so it could be either or, but it will have some importance in regards to some potential wind impacts.
We'll do our best.
Because you see the broader satellite imagery on the screen right now. I see it's on the stream, low latency, of course, but it looks like there that it might just be a feature and that the broader eye is still a bit to the west, but at least in the
Yeah.
latest frames, it looks more like a bit of a northward jog rather than a main continuation of the northwest.
All right, see
So
what
that
you
could
think of
have some
this.
ramifications.
So here's a hybrid loop. Radar along with the satellite, and it's very hard to tell. I think it is just off. It could even make a landfall there on Tsushima. I
Yeah,
can't
it's going to
quite
be a
work it
close
out.
call. I mean, it's going to be a close call, but like you said, still mostly symbolic. Although it definitely will have some ramifications in terms of certain winds impacts with the system, because it moves a bit east of forecast right here, and tries to skirt a bit east along the far eastern coast of South Korea instead of moving a bit west of Busan. There's the possibility that the strongest typhoon force winds could try to remain just offshore rather than over portions of extreme southeastern South Korea. But regardless, even though the strongest winds are on that northeastern side, the strongest rainfall right now is on the northwestern quadrant. So if that happens, that's just really going to be shifting the areas that are receiving some of the strongest rainfall totals by a minute level.
Nonetheless, significant rainfall amounts still along the whole western coast of South Korea, and extending now halfway up the east coast as well, and those rainfall amounts expected to increase. The hotspot for rainfall that the models are suggesting is just over the border in North Korea on the eastern coast, near the South Korea border, so maybe parts of South Korea there as well might get the highest rainfall amounts. I'm not sure about that, but you're really looking at those areas that are in the reds for an extended period of time for the highest rainfall amounts, and even a little bit of purple in one or two locations, but I don't think any of those purples have reached land yet in South Korea.
I mean, if we're talking about those yellows, then a bit of a situation on the very western coast of South Korea. They're not just on the southwestern side, but a bit more going up the coastline. That band has tried to set up just on the very edge of the western coastline there. So more persistent rain bands trying to deliver rainfall and probably some gale force winds at this point to portions of western South Korea, even though the center of the storm is still off the southeastern coast right now.
Very persistent indeed. Let's see what we've got here. Do you think Hyshen will make landfall on Hyoji Island? I don't know how that's pronounced, I just tried. I think it could. That's what I was thinking at the start of tonight's stream, but I suppose if it does move a little bit further east, then maybe it won't. And just to see if we got any more information, nothing just yet. So this is the latest infrared imagery. You can see the storm's influence extending all the way further north through the Korean peninsula, even into China, even into Russia probably, if we could see that high up on this satellite imagery. Yes.
We'll say pretty notably, though, at least in the last 2 hours or so, the satellite imagery on infrared has begun to degrade much more significantly. So even though the winds are still pretty strong, it looks like the storm's trying to get closer to really starting to undergo more of an extratropical transition at this point.
Well, that would be nice.
I mean, even if it does turn post-tropical, sooner than expected a little bit, that isn't going to degrade the threat level at all. There's still typhoon force winds right now and significant rain bands extending hundreds of miles away from the center. So even though the appearance is starting to go down a bit, although I will say notably a nice banding feature trying to hold the southern eye wall together. Not nearly as impressive as earlier today on infrared, although that radar still shows pretty clearly a strong typhoon about to make landfall or just miss landfall along southeastern South Korea. It's going to be a close call right now, but regardless, significant impacts are going to occur.
I don't know, this might be headed straight for Busan.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's going to depend on some wobbles that come on here as well, because even though the eye is much more fragmented than before, it's still quite a large eye feature and eye walls in place right now. So general wobbles are going to mean a lot for the exact location where this thing tries to come on shore. Because if it heads due north from here on out, it could make landfall, a bit east of Busan or over Busan. But if it tries to correct back to the north-northwest, then you could be talking about a bit west of Busan and the strongest typhoon force winds coming straight over the city.
Well, at 25 miles per hour forward motion, there's not much room for wobble.
That's true. It would be pretty hard-pressed right now for this thing to try to hook strangely to the east-northeast and miss any landfall in South Korea at this point in time, unfortunately.
David, any thoughts or news that you've gathered at this point? Is he over there somewhere? Oh.
I'm. Hang on.
Yes.
Yes, I'm just looking at a live webcam.
Oh dear. Breaking up here.
Song.
Breaking up terribly, I'm afraid, David. We'll have to.
And it.
Okay.
Hang on.
I don't know what happened there.
How's that now?
Let's
No
try.
good?
Let's try again.
I'm looking at a live webcam, Seoul, the capital, and unlimited visibility, cloudy,
Unlimited.
no rain, and very light winds.
That'll
That's
change
Seoul.
a bit. That'll change a bit soon. You don't have any reports from Busan or anywhere around there?
I've got nothing, Nathan. It's just
All right.
I'm still searching, but the South Korean Met people, they've got hardly anything on their website. I haven't been able to locate any warnings.
Oh, there are typhoon warnings for the southeastern part of South Korea. The thing is, David, you won't ever see much on the English written website. It's on the Korean website, naturally. A lot of these nations have an English interface and the local language interface, and usually the local language one obviously is a lot more in depth. But this again is the radar imagery of the storm moving either over or very close to Tsushima, part of the Japanese islands, one of the closest Japanese islands to South Korea actually, if not the closest. And beyond that is the Busan region, which it's looking clearer to me at this stage that it's going to go there, honestly. I'm not seeing much of a wobble. It looks like it's moving pretty much due north. And it's just hard to tell, looking at the centre of that radar loop, whether that is actually the eye that's clipping the island, or whether the satellite is more representative and that it's passed just west, and that feature is just a small scale thing.
I think based on the satellite imagery, the actual center of the eye is going to be a bit south, barely, of that kind of jutting feature, a bit further to the southwest of the strongest convective band. So a bit displaced to the west-southwest of that island right now. So, I mean, it could still move a bit east of the 6 hours ago indication and make landfall either on Busan or a bit east of Busan. But, I mean, overall, we're really coming to the end game right here. And it'd be very difficult to see too much significant variation left in terms of exact landfall. Even if we were to take a jog 15 miles further to the east, it'd still make landfall in South Korea. This isn't really a situation with Douglas per se in the Central Pacific earlier this year, where, well, I'm using that as comparison because for that storm, a 15 to 20 mile unexpected jog within a 6 hour time frame, which can happen but isn't really quite common, made the difference between tropical storm force winds occurring on land, which was the expectation for Honolulu, for example, and a clear sunny evening, which is what actually ended up happening. right now, at
JTWC
least.
have released their latest graphic. You're not looking at it there. That is not the up-to-date one. Let's just try again. There it is. That's the latest that's just come out. Obviously, they're going with 100 miles an hour, as we expected. You may notice that the position estimate there is a little bit behind of where it actually is. That's because at their updates, which happen at 9 p.m. UTC, which is right now pretty much. You can see on the bottom left-hand side, that's the UTC time. Same as Greenwich. But their position estimate is as of 3 hours ago. Which is one of the strange things about the JTWC. They use the 3 hour ago position for their current forecast, and then project it forwards.
Is there a particular reason that they do that?
I don't know, but there's not much to say really. Moving inland at very short order, it will pass Busan in about. They reckon it will make landfall at approximately. Actually, they think it might be another 2 hours. But I'm not sure it's going to be that long. Also, another thing, though, the wind field has dropped a little bit, so that's some good news, but not very much, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I will say despite that, they are expecting gale force sustained winds to encompass all of South Korea and almost all of North Korea. And enter parts of Russia and China.
Actually all of North Korea.
Oh, really? I thought it barely missed very northwestern parts of the country, barely.
The positions, yes, but if you interpolate in between,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, so still a very dangerous storm nonetheless. It's almost certainly going to make landfall either over Busan or slightly to the west or east of it. There's very little variation left in that regard. It's really just coming down towards, how is the system develop in the next about 2 to 3 hours or so as it really comes on shore, in regards to, where certain rain bands set up, where it's going to get the highest rainfall totals from situations like that, where the exact wind speeds are going to occur. Notably, they were saying as of 3 hours ago that typhoon-sustained winds were already occurring over extreme southeastern portions of mainland South Korea. So, we're talking about this as, in some way that it's still upcoming, but conditions have already deteriorated very significantly for portions of mainland South Korea already. It's very important to keep that in mind as we continue conversation here. This is an ongoing event that's already impacting land and has been for some time.
Well, it's going to be this next hour, isn't it?
Yeah, that's probably what it's going to come down to more than anything else.
I think landfall will be in the next hour, by the way, but I also feel if there's no typhoon conditions there already, then it's really going to be felt at any time.
Yeah, I mean, they were saying that extreme southeastern portions were getting typhoon conditions as of 3 hours ago. Just missing Busan then. And the storm's moved, about 75 miles or so since then. So it'd be very hard-pressed to not see some typhoon-sustained winds there right now, unless the wind field has really begun to contract more on the northwestern side. Which I will say, to be fair in that regard, the storm is looking much less impressive than it did 3 hours ago.
That I can agree with, definitely. And you can see the brighter colours there near the centre. This really detects the moisture in the storm, this kind of imagery. It's the air mass. And you can see there, there's quite a bit of moisture moving over South Korea, but the main bulk is still about to arrive.
Yeah. That means really, along with the heaviest winds, the heaviest rainfall is really about to come on shore now within the next hour or two as well. We've been talking about some of those banding features, bringing some heavier rain on shore, parts of western South Korea, trying to lick into more of the country. But overall, the heaviest rainfall is really going to just start coming on shore quickly. So you've had generally lighter conditions so far. Those will deteriorate quite rapidly.
All right.
A question for the chat as well.
Just a minute. On the satellite imagery, and I think radar, you can start to see it more now, is that the center of the storm has probably passed just a couple of miles west of Tsushima. So I reckon it is continuing due north, and it will make landfall probably about 10 miles west of Busan.
Yeah, so I mean that looks pretty spot on with the JTWC forecast. barely missing that island and moving up to make landfall just west of Busan. Typhoon conditions, of course, extending east and west of that at that point, really, but still a dangerous storm as it comes on shore, really. A question from the chat. So has the storm already passed Fukuoka already?
What was that?
Someone's asking in the chat if the system's already passed Fukuoka.
Oh, I always forget where that is. That's somewhere up Japan.
Let me get maps on that really
it's past
quick.
most of Japan. I can tell you that. The only places that I haven't seen the worst of this storm yet is Tsushima, which is seeing it right now.
Yeah.
Everywhere else in Japan, the conditions are going to start to get better from here on in.
Yeah, that's on the northern side of Kyushu, a bit west of center on the northern side. It's on the coast.
I see now the prefecture. Yes,
Kyushu.
it's obviously still typhoon conditions possible there, but I would say the worst has just passed in the last hour.
Yeah, and apologies to the bot for timing the guy out because it was mistaken that as a bad word too. But the wind should probably die down there soon enough. The center of the storm's already north of you, and the wind field's larger on the northern side of the storm now. Importantly as well, on top of that, though, is going to be that the rain shield has started to get displaced more than north of the center as the extratropical transition really begins here to ramp up, at least in speed. It'll probably be completed now within the next 36 to 48 hours at most. Land interaction could try to expedite that a bit. But fortunately, that means for large portions of Kyushu and Japan that may have been seeing some rainfall from the storm, that should really clear out pretty quickly as the storm moves away, unlike earlier when you were getting rain preceding the storm by a more significant margin.
6 a.m. in South Korea and in Japan right now. 5 p.m. on the U.S. East Coast, but no new advisories from the National Hurricane Center's Atlantic operations. Julio, 40 miles per hour and a pressure of 1004 in the Eastern Pacific. And here is the Atlantic right now, the latest imagery of Invest 92L, which is getting towards the center of your screen. It's the large one, the one with decent rotation. And that could be a tropical cyclone tomorrow or sooner even, maybe tonight. On the very right-hand side, now in darkness, emerging off the coast of Africa, that's another area of interest that's about to is moving offshore. That's also got a very high chance of formation. They're both at 90% in 5 days, by the way, so they can't get much more confident than that. You've also got two other little features, a 10% disturbance number 3, which is south of Haiti right now. There's hardly anything left of it now. And right next to Bermuda, a little bit of slight rotation you can see from another disturbance 4, which they're giving a 30% chance in the next 5 days. Also, models are suggesting that whatever's behind that wave emerging off Africa will probably also form in the Eastern Atlantic. So by this time, in 5, 6, 7 days, we could be looking at 3 simultaneous tropical storms or even hurricanes.
Yeah, I think we're joined by Isaac right now too, and I think he has some imagery.
Hello.
Good evening.
I've been trying to fight with some of these radar sites to get them to load here. They've been loading pretty slow here, but I got one to work here in South Korea, and you can see an up-close look at Typhoon Haishen currently getting closer and closer to this radar range of sight in South Korea.
I must say this radar imagery is... Hold on, how much is loading? It's a little bit out of date by about half an hour to an hour there, but that is a proper close-up on what we have been looking at.
I'll try to get that fixed then. I've been, like I said, just trying to get these things to load on my end. So I apologize for that.
No problem. It's another good look at this storm as it was moving through the western islands of Japan. Let's see if we can get the very latest right now. Well, there is a loop. Let's just double check for updates on that. Whilst we look at the satellite imagery once again, you can see a bit more clearly that it's just moving, just hugging the western coast of Tsushima. it doesn't appear to me at this stage that it is turning east in any way, and that it will probably make landfall in about within the hour, by 7 o'clock local time. And here we are with the radar again. The latest frame is at 5:55, and the center of the storm is probably just off that southern part of the island or islands. Not sure whether it is multiple islands there, just looking at that graphic. That could well be. And the motion is still pretty much dead north.
Yeah, I mean, we've really been seeing this mostly, the movement estimate as of the recent update from the JTWC is 355 degrees. So that's barely west of due north right now from them. So, any slight variance would change that to really due north, really. Not going to matter too much at this point, though, because it shouldn't change too much within the next couple hours as the storm really gets its final approach and begins to move inland over southeastern South Korea right now.
Alright, some questions then. Is there a high chance that the next two tropical cyclones in the Atlantic will miss America?
I will say, because there's people talking about this in our Discord server
Moderate
as well.
chance.
Yeah, I'd have to say that it's too speculative right now to say something that, if that were to occur, would be over 2 weeks out. It just wouldn't happen. But the indications right now for more of the middle range models are that the Bermuda High, combined with some potential interaction between the two potential upcoming tropical cyclones due to their potential close proximity, will likely cause them to get dragged out to sea before they can impact larger land masses, including the United States and Caribbean, which is fortunate considering we haven't had much luck with the Bermuda High so far this year. But again, because a lot of that is still well past 5 days, you can't really say that with any certainty. It'd be more speculative right now. I think the thing to focus on most regarding both of those invests is they very likely will form. When they form and where is going to be important, especially for 93L potential impacts for Cabo Verde right now.
Back to Hyshen, will this be a rain, wind, or surge maker? I think you could argue for all three.
Yeah, I mean, storm surge is definitely going to be a threat with the size of the storm. I mean, I guess somewhat fortunately for portions of eastern South Korea, where normally a storm rotating counterclockwise would bring more water flow in, Japan kind of cuts that off a little bit, but still quite dangerous. And I'm sure Isaac's, because he's been seeing the radar, can talk about the rain threat too.
Before he does that, I gotta say it is doing pretty well on the infrared satellite imagery. A question that we got there: has it begun to transition to extratropical? Well, it sort of has, but it is really holding its own against that transition phase, especially in those later frames. You do wonder, and I do think it will collapse quite substantially very soon, maybe just as it makes landfall. It could be any time, and it will start to lose its intensity by some distance, some way. Let's see what else we've got. If you've got any questions for us, start your message with Force 13 all in text. And I don't know if Isaac wants to talk about the rainfall.
Well, looking at the Japan Meteorological Agency radar site here, rain rates seem to be, give or take, roughly in about the 30 millimeter an hour range, up to maybe 50 millimeters an hour occasionally in the core of this typhoon here. And keep in mind that this typhoon is moving away from the Japanese radar sites and more into the Korean radar sites at this point. So that could be simply due to the fact that the storm is moving away, so the radars aren't able to get a good grasp on this typhoon as it moves away from it, out of their range. But needless to say, still a major threat for the Koreas here, and unfortunately another impact for them. They got impacted by Typhoon Maysak less than a week ago, actually, and unfortunately this storm will pose no good to them as yet another typhoon threatens them.
Yeah, I mean, and really, again, it's kind of important to note the unusual factor of seeing 3 typhoon-strength storms impact South Korea or just the Korean Peninsula within 2 weeks of each other. This is a pretty rare occurrence to see happen. Of course, you can see 3 tropical cyclones impact the Korean Peninsula within, a calendar year. But to see this frequency within a relatively short time span is something that's much less common to come across.
Exactly. This is a storm to take seriously here for the Koreas. Again, this is not, of course, your first rodeo. You went through Typhoon Maysak earlier, not even a week ago, and another typhoon before that I already forgot the name of. Like you could probably remind me of that one, but still a significant typhoon here, regardless of its intensity here. Still a storm surge threat, a wind threat, and even a rain threat here for the Koreas as it starts to make a landfall on the mainland South Korea here shortly.
I'm just having to take a short minute away here, so I hope you guys can continue. So help Strat and Isaac out here. Send in any questions that you've got about observations or current conditions, and maybe your reports as well if you're on the ground anywhere near this storm. And I'll leave you with the question, how strong will Julio, and I like this, in brackets, Nana, be?
Isaac, you want to take the first crack at that?
Well, I don't have the satellite imagery loop for Julio up right now, but I did see earlier that the National Hurricane Center forecast Julio to peak as a 50 mile per hour tropical storm before it eventually just kind of dissipates out to sea here. Fortunately, for the most part, likely going to be just a rain threat, maybe some increased rip current threat for the coastline of Mexico there. Fortunately, not anything like Hurricane Genevieve was not too long ago for you guys.
Yeah, I forget some earlier this morning's numbers. I think it hit 50 miles an hour, one of the advisories earlier today.
Oh, did it?
But since then, I think so. Don't quote me on that. It was 45 or 50, but I mean, it doesn't really change much. It's semantics, really. But I think it weakened a bit since then, because it was at least 45, and it's back down to 40 right now. And they're saying it could re-intensify again, slightly back to 45 miles an hour for a time period before coming off its peak again and really beginning to fade more, and eventually dissipate in about 2 to 3 days or so.
Oh yeah, I'm seeing it in the newest cone now. Just to quickly talk about it, it's currently located at, as of this latest update, at 3 p.m. Mountain Time, 19.3 degrees north, 110.0 degrees west, with maximum sustained 1-minute winds estimated to be at 40 miles per hour. Moving to the west northwest at 20 miles per hour, moving safely away from the coastline of Mexico here. So it shouldn't be too much of a problem if it still is for you guys along the coastline of Mexico. Again, not going to be nearly as bad as major Hurricane Genevieve was over there not too long ago as it brushed you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is going to be a conversation that some people are going to have about, down the line at least, in post-analysis, how much of this was really Nana or another system really, because the low-level center got eviscerated over Central America as Nana crossed over the basins, but the mid-level center still remains somewhat intact. So, I mean, probably going to keep like this, not Nana in the Eastern Pacific as well, but I'm sure some people will try to talk about it in some regards like that as well.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the tropical cyclone report finds out about this situation here later on, probably into next year here. We'll see about that. Of course, Nana made landfall at Belize as a 75 mile per hour Category 1 hurricane unexpectedly here as a really disheveled looking Category 1, but still a Category 1 system, as what reconnaissance plane found out. I believe the National Hurricane Center did say that the low level center of Nana dissipated before crossing the Pacific, but I believe the mid level center circulation was still somewhat intact. So again, it'll be interesting to see, like you said earlier, Strat, what the National Hurricane Center say about this when it's all said and done, and they do their tropical cyclone report probably sometime in the spring or early fall report.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we go back to the Atlantic really quick as well, 'cause I saw another question there. Someone's asking about the warnings real quick in association with Hyshen. All of South Korea is under some sort of gale or typhoon related warnings right now because of Haishen's impending landfall right now. We went over the wind graphic a little earlier, but it is expected right now that the entire country will experience at least gale force sustained winds, some of it, of course, getting to typhoon sustained. So they have warnings in place for the entire country ahead of that, at least the mainland, of course. And in relation to Japan, these are going to go down soon, but there have been typhoon and gale related warnings in all of Kyushu, reaching into Shikoku and Chikoku as well, due to the just very large wind field that the system's had for much of its lifespan.
Yeah, already just looking at the Joint Typhoon Warning Center cone, the latest cone for this typhoon here, there's already typhoon conditions being felt along the coastline as of this last update from the Joint Typhoon Warning Center. Of course, as of this latest update, they have the storm as an 85 knot typhoon right now, looking at their latest forecast cone. And still a storm to take seriously here, regardless that it's weakening here.
Now, I've only just noticed that as I return here. But that typhoon wind field marked in pink is enormous on the eastern side.
Yeah, it's along the coastline and parts of inland South Korea. Looking at this latest Joint Typhoon Warning Center cone, incredible.
Yeah, I mean, they're saying typhoon sustained winds were happening over the very edge of Busan, heading towards the extreme southeastern parts of South Korea, reaching across the strait between Japan and South Korea, all the way through all of northern Kyushu, and then further off into some of the main islands of Japan as well. So I'm not as great with some of my Japanese geography, but it really goes to show just the expansive wind field that this storm has right now.
I mean, that is only potential. I mean, there might only be one location that gets the hurricane force winds that far out.
That's true. But I mean, it really goes to show the size of the storm and its ability to be able to produce typhoon-sustained winds that far away from its center at this time period.
Well, at this point, landfall is not far away. The last image here was from 5 past, and you can see how the storm's been progressing. This loop is 2 hours long, so you can see how in that time. And it's just about, well, it's still passing Tsushima, and we'll clear that island pretty soon, and then we'll move on to probably Busan.
Yeah, I mean, it's really the final countdown right now. We could be as little as about an hour or so away. It really shouldn't be more than 2 hours at this point, though, just based on the forward speed of around 25 miles an hour.
Landfall is going to happen very soon. Let's see if there's any more questions then. And I'm cleverer than I used to be. I can now click on it without... let's see. Okay, there's a question there about recon in Nana. Can you explain the recon SFMR of non-suspect 97 knots?
That was due to what we call ground shoaling along the coastline here. Pretty much what that means is that waves can sometimes amplify the actual wind speed on the surface there. So when the reconnaissance plane went around that general part of the coastline, they found, I think, a reading up to like 113 knots there, which of course is, blasphemy. It's not an accurate reading whatsoever there, due to that ground shoaling there. I think the highest accurate reading that was recorded in the storm is, I believe, 62 knots SFMR, I believe, in 2 different instances in the storm before it made landfall.
All right. This is the the satellite imagery once again as it passes Tsushima, and landfall will be occurring pretty soon on the southeastern tip of South Korea. We're not going to stay for much longer here because I think it's obviously a foregone conclusion, and we've discussed a lot about the storm's impacts. The landfall will occur soon. It won't mean much different for those in the path of the storm. The effects of the storm will still be very much the same, but we'll take questions for another 10 minutes here. Start your message with Force 13 all in text, and we'll get onto them as soon as possible. But again, you can see the main core of the system is just about to move over land. The highest rain rates are in that area, but what you can see is the rotation is really unwinding, and I think this imagery is actually a little bit more forgiving And there's some other imagery that I've been looking at which is suggesting that maybe it's about to lose Category 2 status now.
Yeah, I mean, it's holding itself up pretty well for a storm of this latitude. But, it is really starting to degrade in appearance. Got to give acknowledgement to that as it really starts to try to begin that post-tropical transition. Still, of course, a tropical cyclone right now, but it's beginning that changeover away from tropicality.
Yep, you're really starting to see it in those very last few frames as it gets pulled apart just a little bit more there. And the convection, you can see just those last few frames, it had reds and then it's down to oranges. Just those 3 frames where you just see it's letting go. But it will still deliver winds of at least 90 miles per hour, officially at the moment 100. That's 150 to 160 kilometers per hour. Sustained winds with higher gusts. And certainly significant amounts of rain could lead to flash flooding, landslides, and a potential for storm surge on the south and eastern coasts.
Nathan, the Joint Typhoon Warning Centre appears to have updated.
Yeah, we covered this.
No, sorry, the 7 nautical mile I.
Okay, we've not gone into the specifics actually, so I don't know if you want to read some of that.
The initial position is based with high confidence based on the eye feature, as I mentioned, 7 nautical miles, partly obscured.
Mm-hmm.
The initial intensity, 85 knots, is based on the agency vortex intensity, so T 4.5 to 5. And the weakening trend is definitely taking place. The environment has become hostile as the system is now only experiencing poleward outflow and has drifted into cooler waters. Furthermore, vertical wind shear has increased to 20 to 30 knots.
And I'll tell you one thing, if not for those 2 previous typhoons, those sea surface temperatures would still be 28 degrees plus, and you'd probably be looking at a mid-range Category 2 landfall.
So it's definitely on the weakening trend.
I mean, if there's any silver lining to the very unusual spring of typhoon activity for the Korean Peninsula, is that some of it has contributed to just the ability to have stronger storms come ashore in this situation to be a bit less likely, fortunately. And that's why we're probably seeing a minimal Cat 2 or mid to high-end Cat 1 as the landfall intensity rather than potentially something that could have been more dangerous, at least in terms of the maximum sustained winds.
And the Joint Typhoon, sorry Nathan, the Joint
okay.
Typhoon Warning Centre is also saying that momentarily the typhoon will exit into the Sea of Japan around 12 hours, then into North Korea and cross into Manchuria by the 36-hour mark.
Yep, that's a little later after the landfall. So it will probably sink in just a few tens of miles into the peninsula off the east coast, and then it will start to move back out as it continues northwards, back into the sea there off the eastern part of Korea, and then swing round. I think it's swinging to the northwest, isn't it? Or just keep going north. Let's take some more questions. People are already prematurely naming these Atlantic systems and whether we expect them to form. Well, we do, but we discourage premature naming. People have gotten, not in trouble, but people have looked very foolish in the past when they've called storms one name, then it gets named another because another one formed out of nowhere. Or in one case, Fiji, and by the way, they're one of my favorite agencies now, because Fiji, someone was preempting their next name a few years ago, and Fiji went to their auxiliary naming list to pick a different name when it formed. That was.
Did they actually do that to spite someone?
Could have been. It was amazing regardless, but don't prematurely name storms. It's not great.
Yeah, I mean, we could say something's likely to form, but until it really has actually been designated as such, you don't really want to give it something prematurely, especially if you're talking in a situation where you got two storms that could form close to simultaneously.
Like now.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really matter as much with these two, just because they're pretty
Yeah.
close to each other. But when you had Omar and Nana, I actually saw video thumbnails, saying tropical storm Nana for, what was coming across, leaving the East Coast, and Hurricane Omar threat for Central America. And of course, it's the other way around, and that can create a string of misinformation and things. You really do want to avoid that.
How strong will 92L be, and when will it become a named storm? Let's look back at the Atlantic once more. This is the latest imagery. So 92 is the one that's made most progress across the Atlantic so far, really swirling around. I think it could become a named storm in the next 24 hours. Talking about its peak intensity, models suggesting that maybe the one behind it, 93L, might be the stronger one. And that could be true, considering this system's very broad and might be slow to intensify. I think it could get to at least minimal hurricane status.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be too surprised to see 93L become overall a stronger storm, just because, like you said, model consensus is much more in favor of that over 92L. Also, I think in terms of land impacts right now, of course, 93L is probably much more of an imminent threat. Whether or not it's a tropical cyclone, by the time it crosses Cabo Verde, it's likely that high-end tropical depression or some tropical storm conditions occur over that country. So I wouldn't be surprised necessarily to see a potential tropical cyclone designation in lieu of that at some point later today. But it really depends on how the National Hurricane Center wants to designate the system based on how it's looking and how close it is to forming, alongside how the government of Cabo Verde wants to issue advisories for the disturbance.
Some more fascinating questions here. Well, first of all, what do we think about 92L's satellite appearance? I know you can only get the wide shot on this, although actually we could get the infrared. Just a minute. Let's get the infrared on here as well. There it was. There it is. So this is right now, and you can see once again, still needs a little bit of work, but it's getting there. Invest 92, especially that flare-up. Looking good, actually. So satellite appearance is good. As good as an invest can be without being designated as a tropical depression, in my opinion. Bit more convection, might get there. And has this been the most typhoons to ever strike South Korea in less than a month? I have no idea, but I will do my due diligence after we finish up our live stream and find out whether that's actually the case, and make a little post about it or something. But also, another question here. Why have there been no cyclones in the South Atlantic off the west coast of Africa? Very interesting question. I guess it's just sea surface temperatures are much cooler, and it's very unfavorable environment. However, there is one occasion where it might have happened, and that I direct you to March 22nd, 1993, for a potential tropical cyclone that formed along the coast of Namibia. Not Namibia, what's above
Angola?
that? Angola?
It was Angola.
Angola.
I think it was. Maybe wrong about that, but yeah, that was a interesting storm. It formed really close to the equator, actually. Really interesting. But I was looking at satellite imagery of that far back, a long time, and looked like there was perhaps a legit tropical, depression at least for maybe a really short time in its life, at least in my opinion. I forgot what it was officially. I think it's barely a tropical storm officially at 40 miles per hour.
You're talking about the 1991 Angola Cyclone.
Oh, yeah, that's what you're talking about.
March 22nd, 1993. There was a system off the coast of Africa. Let me just get the country right first of all, because I think it's still... No, it is Angola. Okay. So, yeah, 1993. Have a little look if you can, and maybe we'll do a documentary on it one day. I don't know. We can't confirm whether it was a tropical cyclone or not, but that's just a little bit of history. Do we think it's possible for the three Atlantic waves, 92, 93, and the upcoming wave, to all be majors or at least hurricanes? And just a one-word answer for that, definitely. It's possible.
Yeah, I mean the basis of the poll in the community tab last night was actually because I saw some of the model support for how vigorous the third wave behind the current two might be, and a lot of people are really expecting consensus with that within the next 7 days. All three of those will likely form, or at least three systems in the Atlantic will form in the next 7 days. Because I know we've been talking a lot about these waves. There is also 10-10, so low odds of development in the Caribbean Sea. But interestingly, the 30% odds of development in the next 5 days, a system moving westward towards the Carolina coastline. So, I mean, that might be something to keep an eye on if it tries to ramp up quickly and become a tropical cyclone. Maybe see some warnings pop up in the Carolinas, although that is still a low chance of development right now.
I'm still struggling to get a read on this radar. I can't tell now whether it actually is moving over Tsushima or not. It's playing games with us right now, but it does look like maybe there is a little bit of a slight eastward bend. I really can't tell. It's going to be very close for Busan at any rate. But there we have it. That's pretty much all we've got for the time being. I don't think it's particularly necessary to stay on the air until the storm passes, because the conditions are pretty much the same from here on in. If you're in southeastern Korea, it's getting bad now. It could get worse in the next 20 to 30 minutes, and then it will start to improve again as the storm washes up the eastern coast. But there we are with winds of around 100 miles per hour. That's 160 kilometers per hour sustained winds, and a pressure of 952. Rainfall rates could be quite high as the storm moves through. At the moment, we're looking at about 30 millimeters per hour in the purple zones, and a little bit lower than that, 20 or 25 in those red zones, but there's quite a lot of those as well. Any final words from the team?
Well, this is still a serious typhoon to take a look at here. And I don't know if you want to look at my screens here. I have a live traffic camera from Busan here on one of the bridges over there. And you can see people still driving over this bridge here, which they shouldn't be doing, and especially given that this is still a formidable typhoon here that's going to be coming on close to, if not perhaps making a landfall over Busan.
Sadly, we can't get that on the screen, but I can tell you vehicles going at a fair old pace along that bridge. And the wind's also going there, I would say, getting towards tropical storm force. But, well, some things don't faze people.
I guess not. That's the unfortunate thing. I just hope they don't stay out too long in this. It's a serious typhoon here. They already had pretty much, I think, one or two other serious typhoons come by near there, so they should have already learned their lesson the past two typhoons here to not be out and about during this.
There are quite a lot of vehicles. I mean, there's a big gap now. Obviously you can't see this, but there's a gap. Quite a lot of vehicles just came through, and now there's a big gap. So maybe that was just a coincidence. But now it looks like the next wave of cars are coming down the bridge. So let's hope for no significant traffic accidents, because those are one of the biggest indirect killers from tropical cyclones. Anyway, for more information, you can stay up to date on our social platforms, Force 13 on Facebook and Twitter. You can get in touch with us on there as well, and through our email. And you can get onto our Discord server, discord.gg/Force13. Our vibrant community is ready to communicate and talk about everything to do with this storm and beyond in the wide world of weather and our lives. That's it for now, and you can rewatch this live stream when it concludes to check out what we were talking about. See you for now.